Welcome to the STATMed podcast, where we teach you how to study in med school and how to pass board-style exams. Your host is Ryan Orwig, a learning specialist with over a decade of experience working with med students and physicians. In the second episode of our Uncommon Pathways mini-series, we're back with JT, a former Doctor Study Skills course participant and board's workshop participant who shares his journey to becoming an orthopedic surgeon. In this episode, Ryan and JT dig into study-based issues and key strategies to mitigate them.
Yeah, you're preaching one of the points we advocate, right?
Correct.
The fear of missing out is overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly.
There's so much information out there now. Now, one of the bigger variables, the monkey wrench, is that there's so many options, so many resources that you see more and more students dividing their focus over multiple resources. So they're familiar with a bunch of resources, but mastering none of them. And through that conversation, we decide that, test taking was a problem. So you had watched that 5 reasons why, smart doctors and med students fail boards. And that really spoke to you. And I was like, definitely the test taking is definitely a problem. We've got to fix that. But then we talked about on the front end where, the information that's coming to you, how that needed to be addressed as well. So the front end is study methods. The back end is test taking. A lot of people, that's why we have to have a conversation, sort of figure this stuff out, to figure out where the intervention should be. And what I think with you was that, you're one of these top-down learners, meaning you need structure up front. You need to seek, find, build the structure, extract the structure, build it so that you can it's represented in your mind. And then as you work through the material, get to retrieval practice early and often and iteratively. And I think that my hypothesis is, why was this not a problem for you earlier? Well, I think you just had the bandwidth and the cognitive ability to get through it. I also think that as rough as med school can be, the problems that are created from PowerPoint-based lectures, which you hated as a med student, it was still structured enough that you could get through it. Even in rotations, as much as you didn't like doing stuff like family med or OB-GYN because it wasn't surgery, as much as you didn't like that, and as disorganized as those things are, there was still enough of structure, enough of a pocket. Now, for somebody else, it might collapse in that first semester of med school. For somebody else, it might collapse in that second rotation because it's just too clinical and not enough structure. But for you, it was okay. But once you got to this like just surgery and the sheer scope of it and the sheer work rate of it, and you understood stuff, but you didn't have that large conceptual framework, the super frameworks, the specific frameworks. And that's where the organization, where we needed to say, okay, we need to teach JT how to get in there through 1 or 2 primary resources, extract structure, and build off of that structure. And we, I think in that first conversation, we pretty much decided that was the problem. Therefore, we had to teach study methods first and then test taking methods. We have this thing called the Doctor Study Skills course, where it's a one-on-one, like, hey, let's get in there, let's rebuild this guy's study methods. And again, I think your program was super generous with helping us structure your time so you could take that stuff on board. Although it is pretty fast, relatively speaking, remote, one-on-one online. And we got in there and it, sort of re-engineered those study methods first. And then I think you, use those methods for a few months or something like that?
Yeah. So I'll backtrack just a little bit. I spoke with you in the fall of my chief year. And I said, look, I think I'm probably going to use y'all, but let me just kind of continue with this, because I had what I thought was a pretty good study schedule leading up to the in-training exam in my 5th year. And so I said, let me see kind of how I do with this process, and then I'll let you know after I get my score back. So anyway, finished my own schedule or whatever. And I did terrible on the in-training exam that year. And, every year it gets harder to do well, just because everybody else is studying and has accumulated knowledge of the more knowledge, and then more knowledge of the test, just better test taking. So I did bad. I did not do well, and I was really freaking out. And so I called y'all shortly thereafter. It's like, all right, we're doing it. So I started the study skills course, I believe, in like January. So that's kind of a little background to how I got there.
So going through the study stuff, the study skills course, part of that is also teaching you just to be an expert in your own learning, teaching you to be an expert in your own learning needs, and where does learning break down for you? What are the things you need? So what do you think were, let's just say, 3 of the biggest like insights that you gained from the study skills course? Like this is what I was doing wrong, and then this is how I fixed it. What can you say about that stuff?
I would say that overarching, like the kind of biggest thing, it was that I was very passive in how I would study. So that meant just rereading material that I had read 1,000 times over, and just thinking, okay, well, maybe it'll stick this time, or if I just keep reading this, like it'll get imprinted into my into my subconscious. And that I realize it's not good because it's not intentional.
Yeah.
And so what the study skills course taught me was that you have to intentionally engage the material, and the way you do that is by test and retesting. So, instead of just reading through a passage or an article or a review book, I had to framework this out. And on those key points, like instead of me just rereading that key point, like I would have a blank, and it would be, name these 3 things associated with this fracture pattern. And instead of just rereading them, I would have to say, okay, I actually have to recall what these three things are.
The problem is once you read something and you reread it, you are getting diminishing returns. That is what I call the illusion of mastery, because you are looking at it and it's right there in front of your face. I feel like it's like looking at gym equipment. It's like hanging out at the gym. Like I was at the gym for 2 hours. Why am I not ripped? I go to the gym every day. I said, what are you doing at the gym? And so this idea of look, and you're and in your mind, you're like, man, that was terrible. I hated it. Rereading this boring stuff over and over again that you recognize when it's in front of your face, but you're not building the retrieval mechanism. See, I don't think we think enough about building the pathway, the retrieval pathway. Like if you're walking through the woods, if you walk through the woods once, it's not going to make a path. It's the back forth that builds the pathway. When we study, we need to be thinking about retrieval pathways. We need to, and every time we hit that memory, we're solidifying that memory and making it more accessible.
Yeah.
And, when we think about this act of retrieval, I think the other, and you're saying both at the same time. I think on the front end, you're also talking about seeking and finding and extracting that framework. That's one of the secrets to this, right? That's what your brain doesn't build as organically as many of your orthopedic surgery.
That is
peers.
so true.
And so I'm assuming that was also a part of your studying, going into your primary source or your article, seeking and finding and extracting the framework, correct?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And so this kind of this 2 things you say kind of dovetail with my big mistakes studying. So I'll start with this. Talking about going to the gym, just looking at gym equipment. I realized that my studying was I would just go into a study session and just be like, okay, well, I guess I'll read for an hour or whatever, and it's like it was just reading for an hour, and it was there wasn't any goal of saying, okay, I'm going to get through this, and I'm going to retest these 3 things. Like it wasn't intentional. It was just kind of this haphazard thing of like, all right, I've got some time on Saturday morning. I'm going to read for 2 hours. And then you get to the end of 2 hours and you're like, well, did I read enough? Like did I do anything? So you just kind of have this huge, you're just stuck in this mire of self-doubt of like, did I even do anything for the past 2 hours?
You suffered. You suffered for 2 hours.
Yeah. And so there was an illusion of studying, and it wasn't things that were active. So a lot of times was just kind of going in and looking at the gym equipment rather than actually, working out on it. And then the other thing too, in terms of the structure and the framework, I realized that I didn't have a great primary source. So residency is, and I imagine people across all residencies would attest to this, but it's difficult to have a structured curriculum because you're busy. You may only have one didactic lecture a week, or something like, or one didactic day a week, or it's hard to say, okay, this is what I'm gonna study today. And so there's a real need for everyone to have one or two primary sources that they use as like their Bible for residency. And I realized that I kind of jumped around a lot in residency in terms of my primary sources. I would read review articles and things like that from journals. There's a fantastic website that is available to orthopedic residents called Ortho Bullets, which has everything like a bulleted format, but there's not a lot of depth to it. They have questions that are associated with it. Like every orthopedic resident knows what Ortho Bullets is, and they all work the Ortho Bullets questions. I mean, it's like 7,000 questions or something in their bank. So everybody knows about it. And it's a great resource, but there's not a lot of depth, to it. So what I ended up realizing was I just didn't have a great primary resource, and I would just jump around between different things. And there was no, like you're saying, structure for me to hang everything, all of my knowledge on. Whereas in undergrad and in med school, like you had a hard copy textbook, or you had this PowerPoint. But in residency, you're just kind of left to your own devices. So one thing that I did that I think just completely changed my understanding, and particularly how I approached the way I accumulated knowledge for the test, was I got one review book, and I started in January with Miller's. I said, you know what, I'm going to get all the way through this book, and this is going to be my structure for how I organize things in my head. And that was huge for me.
And so that was using our methods, using the methods we taught you. Yeah, you're preaching one of the points we advocate, right?
Correct.
The fear of missing out is overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly.
There's so much information out there now. Now, one of the bigger variables, the monkey wrench, is that there's so many options, so many resources, that you see more and more students dividing their focus over multiple resources. So they're familiar with a bunch of resources, but mastering none of them.
Yeah, it is a real problem. And this is something that I started to realize in medical school. And if we're backtracking a little bit, kind of to my step studying, I used DIT to study for step one, and that gave you a structure. But even then, like I still had this, like you're saying, this FOMO of like, oh, well, this person's using this, maybe they're getting a better like study experience. Looking back, I realized I never really like fully sold myself to DIT, because I always had this thing in the back of my mind. It's like, oh, this may not be good enough.
Yeah.
And that's such a mistake now, looking back on it. And I did the same thing with step two. I wasn't super organized. I used online med ed, was just getting started when I was studying for step two. So I used that a lot. But even then, I was kind of jumping around between various things. And, you realize you spend more time jumping around trying to decide what you should study rather than actually studying the material.
That's like when you're sitting down to study, cleaning your bathroom or organizing your closet is never more appealing than when you're in that second hour of studying, right? Like, that really needs to happen. No, it doesn't. Likewise, I think this chasing various resources. Let me research this. Let me look into this. Let me dip in from one resource to A to resource B to resource C. It feels like you're being productive.
Yeah.
But but it's not. It's not.
Yeah,
and so you can say,
true.
like, I studied for 3 hours, but really how many of those hours were spent toggling between or researching or looking? And like you said, this idea, like maybe they're having, what you said was so salient, because you're like, what if they're getting a better experience over there? Mm-hmm. Just pick one and master it. And if you have to supplement here and there, that's fine. But I think that's a big part of what you did, and what Dave and I talked about whenever you're doing the study skills course. It's like, look, pick one or two, and just work through it mechanistically, and just bang, 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 work through it. Framework, extract structure, read it once, and get to retrieval practice. That what we call like the self-test, the retest, whatever you want to call it, right? It's not, none of this has to do with practice questions.
Right.
None of it has to do with practice questions. I really want to silo studying on the one side, test taking on the other.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, test taking is super important. I mean, that's where you and I start. That's what we started off talking about. But you have to organize, encode, and retrieve this stuff. So, you've talked about the power of adding the framework and adding the retrieval practice, getting out of just passive rereading. What's another big mistake you might have identified that you then rectified by working through with our system?
Yeah. So what she said about siloing things out, that was kind of an aha moment for me, because I realized that y'all's program made me realize that test taking and studying are two different things.
Absolutely.
And so often what I would do, and again, this is one of those things I would ask people like that do well in the OIT, like, how do you study? Like, what are you doing to hit 95th percentile every year?
Yeah.
And they would just be like, oh, I just work questions. I just work questions. So I would just work questions. And so I've realized that for me, that did not work, because I didn't have a good structure for understanding and organizing the material in my head.
Yep.
And so when I would go work questions, I would get just these random tidbits that would just be, thrown into my brain and just kind of rattle around for forever.
Yep.
And I may or may not be able to get it back. And then I was also, what I come to find out, I was not reading questions, not working questions in a very effective way. So I was just doing this like halfway studying and halfway working questions, and I wasn't getting benefit of either one of those things, because they're two separate things.
Well, and I do think there's a large percentage of the med student population that can just rip through questions and get profound benefit. Those are what are called bottom-up learners. They can take all these fragmented details, and I imagine they've got like these elves living in the back of their brain, as like the cartoony metaphor. And so you're throwing all these details into the room of your memory, and they're in there organizing it, putting it where it belongs. Whereas you don't have any elves. I don't have any elves. If I throw the stuff in there, it's just going to rattle around, because I need structure first.
Yeah.
And without that, it doesn't work. But I think it happens because so many people are so successful with it. So when somebody, if you go to your med student, you're a med student, you go to your advisor, they're like, well, you're probably not doing enough practice questions. But this goes back to what you were saying. Like, let's think about this a little more sensitively. Yeah. Let's think about this a little more discreetly, and not put everybody in the same box. Then you got to figure, once you get to the realm of orthopedic surgery, I bet you the majority of people who make it there are bottom-up learners. They can learn organically through experiential learning, through just doing volumes of questions. And they've got the elves. They've got the workforce that's doing this stuff. And just because you don't have those elves has nothing to do with your IQ, has nothing to do with your aptitude, has nothing to do with your ability to be an amazing surgeon. It's just a matter of, we need to flip this around and figure out a way to learn better.
Yeah, and that's, I'll have to brag on my wife a little bit. My wife is a resident as well in a very, very competitive field, and she is like the definition of that, like bottom up learner, because she can just sit there, crank out questions, and make a 265 on step 1 and 2, and she just has all those like random facts in her head about like medicine, and it just drives me crazy, because I'm like, how do you remember that? And it's funny, but I mean, we're so completely different in that regard. But I think, to your point about structured learning, to kind of put it another way, like, I love concepts. I love big, broad picture things that that guide your understanding of more details. And so for me, if I don't feel like I have a good understanding of like these broader, bigger picture stuff, it's not even worth me going into the details, because I don't have this broad understanding of these concepts. So I'm 100% a very very much a top down learner, and that's something that y'all's program has helped me really realize about myself, that has helped me in a number of ways.
Yeah, and giving the tools to then actualize that is the key. Like, for some people, you can just maybe shine a light on that, and they're like, okay, I'll go fix it. But I think for somebody like you, giving them the tools to do it, I think is a big deal.
Yep.
And then what about this other point we have here about being intentional with what or how long you study?
Yeah. So using the review book that I decided, like, look, this is what I'm going to do. This is going to be my resource for studying for the boards. As I worked to framework that book, it became so much easier to say, all right, in 2 weeks, I want to have this section completely framework and have tested and retested. And so it gave me a very discrete point to be like, okay, if I get through this, like, I've gotten through this, and this is something that I have learned. I've framework. It may not be perfect, but it's something that I can build on. And so in a way, it kind of gives you this peace of mind of like, oh, okay, I've gone through the foot and ankle section. Like, I have a framework for that kind of stuff. I need to reinforce that at some point, but I've got it. And so being intentional every time, setting the big goals, saying, all right, I want to be through this section in 2 weeks. But then even on a day-to-day basis, saying, okay, I need to framework this page, and I need to go back and retest this stuff right here. That was huge for me, because it gave me a concrete thing to say, okay, I've studied today and this is what I've done.
As opposed to, what was it like before? I think you've mentioned this, but just to underscore.
As opposed to, all right, I'm going to study foot and ankle. I'll read this review article on flat foot deformity, and then work a few questions on it. And then, you're like 45 minutes into reading about flat foot deformity, and then you're like, oh shoot, like they mentioned bunions. I don't really know much about bunions. I should go back and like read that. And then all of a sudden, you look up and you're reading about, calcaneus fractures, and you're like, how did I get here? Yeah, it was just this shotgun approach of like, oh, well, I looked at all these things, like it'll stick eventually.
No,
it just doesn't work.
Well, and again, I think what you're talking about is maybe falls under the category of workflow generation. This ability to sit down, generate your own workflow, break large tasks into smaller tasks, cross items off when you know you've done it, so that you can walk away at the end of the day and say, yeah, I know what I've accomplished. You also can do multiple things in a given sitting down to study, instead of just one big, vague, nebulous cloud of like stuff that I have to do. And again, it all adds up day by day, week by week, month by month. So that's sort of where you work through some of your study skills things. Again, I think the big umbrella this falls under is getting more bang for your buck every time you sit down to study. It's really invaluable.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So then,
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the STATMed podcast. In the next episode, Ryan and JT will dig into test-taking issues and strategies to fix them. If you like the show, be sure to rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. You can find more test-taking and studying strategies specifically designed for med students and physicians over at our blog, STATMedlearning.com. Thanks for listening.